it's Doris with all of the books, and I am here with Friday Reads, except it's Saturday. But you know, time goes at its own pace when one is in Florida on vacation. So here we are, we're here. I finished Miss Burma early on in the week. I was almost done with this one, and I did finish it off right as my vacation started, and I really enjoyed this. It is, I got it because it was longlisted for the Women's Prize, and it's a book based in Burma from a little bit in the 1920s, but most of it is just prior to World War II, and then through the war, and then all of the conflicts within the country after the war as well, and just what a conflicted country Burma was, and how much of that was based in well, partially with the two, one was considered an ethnic minority group. There's two ethnic groups, but the minority group is, you know, approaching 50% of the country, but the two ethnic groups were pitted against each other, and a lot of that from the foreign powers, first the British and then the American, and just how that played out. And this was based on the author's biographical information from her parents and grandparents. So it's fiction, but based in a lot of family truth, and just a fascinating read, and a part of history and a part of the world that I wasn't as familiar with. So very fascinating. And from a multicultural perspective also, the father in this story is of Jewish heritage, and the mother is from the Karen ethnic minority group. So yeah. Now from a literary perspective, it wasn't quite as good. It's written third person perspective with not as much dialogue as you would expect from a fictional read, so it kind of keeps you at a distance from the characters. So it's almost like historical figures, which, I mean, they were in a sense because it's based on truth, reality, but you know what I mean? So I enjoyed it from a historical perspective, but from a storyline, if that's what you're looking for, it might not be what you're looking for, if that makes sense. And then I finished, let me get it up here on my son's little phone, Enchanted April, and this was enchanting. I loved it so much. This is the story of 4 women who together rent a medieval castle in Italy for the month of April. It was published in 1922, so I assume that the setting is right around the turn of the century. I just loved this. These women all have something in their past or their personalities that are keeping them distanced from other people in their lives, and something about being in Italy and in this castle and together really brings all of them out and lets them reconnect with each other, and then with the other people in their lives and their relationships. And I just really loved it. Elizabeth von Arnim is fast becoming a new favorite of mine. I read, what was that other book I read? Gosh, now that I want to know. Oh, Elizabeth and Her German Garden. That was the first one I read, and Ange had recommended it on her channel, and I just was consumed by it, and I read this one, and I'm just completely charmed. So I have Vera and one other, that all of these I've gotten off Book Depository with this cover, cover style. I'm just They're from Vintage. Yes, I just am loving Elizabeth von Arnim. And then the next one I finished was Cannibalism by Bill Shute, and another great read. I read this one, my buddy read it with Heidi, and it was just what we were looking for. It's about cannibalism. What can I say? It's written though from a topical perspective, so she doesn't like go in and research cannibalism among different species or famous instances of cannibalism. She goes topically the thought processes behind cannibalism and why it occurs in the natural world and in the human world, and scientific hunts for cannibalism, and was it as prevalent in society as people thought it was back in the day? Just really, is it right to say it was a fun read? Because it really was, and very, very interesting as well. And then I finished Barracoon a few days ago by Zora Neale Hurston. This is nonfiction also. This is some interviews with what was his Cujo? Lewis, who was the last known man brought over on a slave ship from Africa, and this was well after it had been outlawed. So this group of slaves were smuggled into the country right before the Civil War. So Zora Neale Hurston was on a fellowship able to go interview Cujo, and this is very brief. The actual interview part is probably only about 100 pages, and I really enjoyed reading it. It's not very in-depth. It's only 100 pages, and they're just strictly interviews, but you get a real sense of him as a person. So this one reminded me of my dad, actually, just because he's 87. He's turning 87 this week, in fact. And you know, you get to that age and it's just nice to have somebody listen to you, and you just kind of go with the stories that are on your mind and whatever triggers them. So this, like I said, it's not a cohesive narrative. There's somewhat of a narrative to it, but it's more just listening to what he has to say and just the thoughts that come up with him. And so yes, very enjoyable from that respect. And then there are some forward and parts at the back, just kind of putting Zora Neale Hurston herself and her literary career just in perspective, and I'm finding her interesting as well. And every book of hers I read, I've got another one, a short story collection that I'm going to read next, and every book I learn a little bit more of her because she has quite a background, and her attempts at recording the slave narrative and the folklore narrative in the African American community and how that was received in the time. Yeah, very interested in her as an author and a person. So that one, and then the last one I finished so far this week was The American Plague by Molly Caldwell Crosby, and this is the untold story of yellow fever, the epidemic that shaped our history. So this is about plague here in the United States, and this one really hit close to home because I grew up hearing about the yellow fever because it was very, very prevalent in my hometown back in the 1800s when the town was established. And so my son and I actually went to the yellow fever museum. A doctor that was instrumental in treating yellow fever in a little town close by, we did that this week, and it was just fascinating hearing about the fever itself and the idea. It was interesting with these two because with this one, you know, obviously yellow fever came on slave ships from Africa, and the population here was not equipped genetically to deal with it, and it was kind of a sow the wind, reap the whirlwind kind of thing with the yellow fever. But yeah, and so you hear the medical perspective and the historical perspective. Really interesting. This is set in Memphis, Tennessee, and how those boom towns were getting large and huge and not prepared for the masses of people. The plumbing situation was completely non-existent, and what people thought that plague came from and what they found out where it actually came. We find out about Walter Reed, who is a name that is synonymous with military medicine, and I didn't know what a big guy he was in the historical timeline. But yeah, he was instrumental in figuring out where plague came from, the mosquito. So yeah, I'm gonna take myself inside now so the mosquitoes can't chew on me anymore. But great reads this week. I thoroughly enjoyed myself, and I will chat with you soon.